Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. In this episode, we hope to help you thrive in life and leadership. And I want to tell you about two things before we dive in. First of all, how is your team culture? You know, my friends at Leader have an assessment for you to really tell whether your employees are engaged or not. You can check it out at leader.com/culture. That's leadr.com/culture. Just click the link. And I've got something for you called the Preaching Cheat Sheet. I've been communicating, preaching, giving keynote talks for over 30 years. And there's a hard way to do it and an easy way to do it. And I can't do the hard work of coming up with great content, but I can show you how to do it better, faster, and far more efficiently so that you can really focus on what matters. I've got 10 steps inside the cheat sheet that will help you get to a great talk faster starting right now. You can just click on the link or go to preachingcheatsheet.com. That's preachingcheatsheet.com. And now to today's episode. Warren and JJ, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you, Carey.
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, you're so welcome. So Warren, I want to start with your research because you're always doing so much research. Church planting is changing. What are the big differences between 20 years ago planting a church and today?
Yeah, great question. ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, did the largest ever study of North American church planting. So Carey, 8% were Canada.
Hey.
And so the lay of the land is really different than 20 years ago. There are church planters. Church planters are older. Average age right now at launch is 42.
Wow.
That's climbed by 6 years over the last 15 years. And there are huge implications for that. There's more team-based leadership. There are more women planters and partner planters with husbands. There's more multiracial church plants, disproportionately so. They're more likely to partner with a local church rather than to be like parachuted in by a denomination. There's more openness to going quickly to multiple services and to multi-site. There are more thoughts about multiplication. The first church I planted, survival by next Sunday was my goal. But today's planners are very different. So, Carey, we could unpack any of those, but that's a quick summary of differences.
So basically nothing's changed is what you're saying, Warren, right?
Well, and then we could even talk about the pandemic and that short 3-year window, what changed during then.
Well, let's go there too, and then we can start to unpack it. So what changed in the last 3 years?
A lot more transfer growth during the pandemic.
Okay. Can I stop you there? Do you have stats for that, or is that a guess?
Yes, we ask everybody in the survey to take their current congregation and size it up by 5 categories. How much, and I'll start at the bottom, kind of biological growth, kids. How much is transfer growth locally and transfer growth from out of the area? How much is conversion growth, which would mean receiving Christ as your Savior for the first time? And how much is renewal growth, which would be like de-churched people coming back to church and starting over? And we've got percentages. I've got all kinds of free reports, free downloads at ecfa.org/surveys. But the bottom line, the transfer growth for during the pandemic was almost double what it was for churches prior to the pandemic. And not to pick on church plants, I think there was a big reshuffling all over the map of all kinds of churches during the pandemic, including the majority of people who were part of more than one church during the pandemic in terms of viewing habits.
That's true. So do you know, and maybe the data doesn't go there, but you mentioned 2 kinds of transfer growth, because I think most people would say, the whole nation shuffled, like everybody moved towns and cities and houses and neighborhoods, and we had the housing bubble and the whole deal. How much of that transfer growth was relocation versus just people packing up from their old church and going across the street to the new one?
So for new churches during the pandemic, 42% of the congregation was described as transfer growth locally, whereas churches prior to the pandemic, the growth was local transfer growth was 26%. So 42 versus 20% for local transfer growth. Outside transfer growth was identical, 21% for both.
Interesting. So you're saying 63-ish% of all the growth of growing churches in the last few years was transfer growth?
Of new churches during the pandemic.
Gotcha. Okay.
Wow.
Interesting. Now, we've had conversations before, and JJ, feel free to jump in on some of this, where you said the way to get people to go to church is to plant new churches. But that sounds like that's also true for transfer growth.
Yes, but if I have 5 to 10% of people coming to Christ each year, I've got to have all kinds of believers to support that. Example, the people we invited to Easter, if they came and come to Christ, it's going to be like 3 years before they're giving. So there's got to be some kind of core that's doing the volunteering underwriting the finances until that point. So incidentally, growing churches, by the way, have a lower per capita giving than non-growing churches because the growing churches have that kind of free rider, the first-time guests who are checking it out, kicking the tires, and aren't anywhere near a spiritual commitment. And that's good, I think.
JJ, does any of this surprise you? We're going to continue with trends. I have a feeling we'd spend an hour on trends, but JJ, weigh in. So give us a little bio of how you and your wife got started in ministry and what you do, and then we'd love your color commentary along the way.
Yeah. So I've been in church kind of my whole life. My first job was selling shoes. And then after that, it was ministry. And so from 17 on, the church has been my life. Graduated from Southeastern University, have a master's in divinity. I've done youth ministry for a long time. And then when I was about 28, 29 years old, my wife and I felt the call to launch a church. We were youth pastoring at a church about 35 minutes, 40 minutes south Orlando, which is where we are in Florida. And I felt the call, and it was something I never wanted to do ever. I mean, I literally remember one of my first phone calls with my wife when we were dating, and we were talking about just kind of the life that we envisioned and wanted to make sure that we were both on the same kind of trajectory before we took things emotionally to the next level. And she was like, "Hey, I'm down for whatever God has for our family. If that's what God wants for us, to get married." I was like, "Cool, me too." I was like, "Is there anything you wouldn't do though?" Like missionary in Africa. She was like, "No, I'd be down for that. But there's one thing I wouldn't do." And I was like, "What's that?" She's like, "Start a church. I'd never want to ever start a church." And then I remember telling her, I was like, cool. Me too. Me neither. I would never, ever want to do that. That's just the worst. That's so hard. Why would you want to do that? And so it really had to be the Lord. I really think you have to be super duper confident in the calling that God has on your life. And of course, by super duper confident, I mean like 70%, right? Because that's as high as you're allowed to go percentage-wise, and still call it faith, But for me, it was the Lord just speaking to me after doing years of youth ministry. I was in a hotel room in North Carolina at a conference and just felt the Lord speak to me. And so I always tell people the way that God speaks when it comes to church planning, it's usually through two sensitivities. It's one, being sensitive to His Spirit, being sensitive to His leading, and knowing that there's going to come a time where He's going to ask you to do things that are maybe outside of your comfort zone. And the second comes through a story that my wife had. She was at a gas station, because after He spoke to me, I was like, okay, I want to do it. I'm ready to plant. Lord, I hear you clearly. I'm pretty sure this is what you want me to do. But I remember telling Him, are you going to have to speak to my wife? Because my wife, she is ride or die. She's got my back. And I didn't want to be the one to tell her, hey, babe, I think God called us along to church. Because if it failed, then it'd be my fault. So I was like, no, Lord, it's got to be you. So that if it fails, we can both look at you and be like, hey, we were just being obedient to what you called us to. And so sure enough, a couple months later, she was at a gas station, and this couple came up, they pulled up in a car, and this guy came out, asked for some money to help with his car, fill up the gas tank, and she did it. And while she was doing that, she pretty much shared the gospel with him and asked him how, he was doing, because when she looked in the backseat of his car, there was his girlfriend, there was some pillows, a blanket, and a baby. And come to find out that he had just gotten released from prison, and they were living in the backseat of their car looking for work. And so she just kind of shared about the church where we were youth pastoring at the time. And he came in on Sunday, and I happened to be preaching that Sunday, which is a big deal if you're the youth pastor preaching at a church. Like, I don't remember exactly what day it was, but it was probably like Time Change Sunday, or, one of those Labor Day, Memorial Day weekends where they give the youth pastor some reps. And so I got to preach. And when I made the call for salvation, his name was John. His wife's name was Rita. It's been 8 years since I've seen them, but I could remember their faces, remember their names. They came up, gave their lives to Jesus. My wife and I sat back in the front row when the service was done. And I looked at her, and she was really emotional. She looked at me and she said, "Could you imagine a building a church where and this are the words that she said that became the mission statement of our church, where Jesus could be accessible to anyone." John had no background in religion, had no background in Christianity. He was literally out of prison in his car at the altar. And we thought, wouldn't it be cool to start a church like that for that kind of a person? Or Central Florida, we're a part of the Bible Belt-ish. We got a lot of churches. And so we knew that if we were going to launch a church, it had to be specific. There had to be a call on our life for a specific target audience. And so our mission statement is to make Jesus accessible to anyone. And that's who we exist for. People.
And when did you start Journey Church? Yeah.
We started Journey Church in 2016, September 2016.
Cool. Okay. So the stats, that's an awesome story. And I guess your wife was on board at that point. What about what Warren has shared so far resonates with you? And is there anything that seems a little bit like, not so sure?
No, I think the transfer growth is real. And I think there's a lot of layers to that. In our city alone, we had a couple of big name pastors through the pandemic who suffered moral failures. There were churches that couldn't make it financially. I mean, there's a lot of factors that played in to that. And people would come. I think as a pastor, you have to be careful when people come, especially when people come with church hurt. Because if they come to your church talking about their last church, it's probably going to be just a matter of time before they leave your church talking to you about their next church. And so we try not to build our church on transfer growth. But to Warren's point, you need someone to help you resources wise in the meantime while you reach these unchurched people who are really being educated on giving, on serving, on baptism. I love our church. Our church is probably, and I wish I had the exact numbers, and I know I'm going to try not to do the preacher rounding up thing that we do as preachers, but I've got someone from our staff recording this, so they can call me out if I'm wrong, but I would say probably 50% of our church has given their life to Christ in the last 3 years. Like the first time, or the first time since they were 7 or 8 years old. That's great. We love them. They're passionate. They're just messy. And they don't really know church, which is great because they come with a blank slate. But the other part of that is, they don't know what it's like to serve or what it's like to give. And so we're grateful for the people that God sends. And I think as a pastor in this season, you just got to learn how to love with an open hand, kind of just release people when they're ready to move on and go, and thank them for the time that they were there. I think more than ever now we have to be careful because of the things. I think Warren said that people went to 2 or 3 churches during the pandemic at one time because, everybody's church was who you listen to. So I think we have to beware church becoming a commodity. One of many things. It's whether I buy Heinz brand or whether I buy this brand, it's just that. And so that can happen. And so you got to kind of just figure out what makes your community unique. And love people as they come and as they go, and just know who God's called you to reach.
Mm-hmm. So how, Warren, do you determine, like if someone's listening going, I don't know what percentage of my church is transfer growth. Like I had a methodology that I used for years that I think we still use at Connexus and I think is reasonably accurate. But what are the filters or criteria that help you determine whether you're actually getting new growth or transfer growth? New growth being previously unchurched people.
Yeah, good question. In this study, we asked the pastor, and we said, you got 5 categories, you size it up. The good news is they probably, if they lie, they all lie equally. And so you've got some kind of factor. But I have done other studies of people in the pew, so to speak, saying did you come to faith in Jesus Christ through the ministry of this church? And churches that are new churches and disproportionately large churches, mega churches, really rate high in the people in the pews saying, like JJ's example, yes, my spiritual life either started all over again right here.
Gotcha.
And that creates a fierce discipleship potential, loyalty potential, go the journey, teach me how to do this potential. And it can be a very exciting road, even as, I love your word, JJ, it's messy.
Yeah. Do you have particular criteria that you use, JJ?
No, most of it's been anecdotal. I try to sit in the lobby and meet people and talk to people. And one of the first questions I ask is, how'd you hear about us? And typically that'll kind of open the floodgates of, I used to go to this church, or my friend invited me, or I was an atheist, so I would think it's mostly anecdotal, but I love that you had a process. You got to shoot me over your process over at Connexus.
Warren Bird, and try to figure out whether this is good or not, Warren. What we did, and when we do the, new here card and people give us their name and address and phone number, email, all that stuff, we ask one question with 4 categories. And the question is, prior to attending Connexus, I attended church. And then we have 4 categories, I think. So every week, right? Once a month, a couple times a year, or never. And if it was a couple times a year or never, we counted that unchurched, because people always exaggerate. It's like, when was the last time you went for a physical? It was like, probably like 6 months ago. No, it was 6 years ago, actually, that you went. And I think I can put David Kinnaman on record that saying people tend to exaggerate their church attendance when they're asked to respond to a poll. So we felt...
It's called, by the way, Carey, the halo effect.
The halo effect. There you go. So usually between 50 and 60% of our people tick those last 2 boxes, once or twice a year or never. And we said, okay, that's good. And then the rest were transfer growth. But we always wanted to tip into the majority. One of the theories I have, and I'd love to test this out with both of you, but Warren, I'll start with you, is that this transfer growth is what economists might call market consolidation. So there used to be a lot of independent bookstores, then Barnes & Noble and Borders came along, and then Amazon came along. Now there's not as many independent bookstores. It's not like the whole world started to read because these giant stores arrived. It's just like, no, what used to be served by 10 bookshops is now served by 1. And so in the same way that as America is becoming more post-Christian, you now have fewer churches, but the churches that remain tend to be a little bit larger and have momentum, unless they're hanging on by life support. Any thoughts on that? Do you think it's a form of market consolidation, or do you have another theory or take on that?
A good Canadian named Reginald Bibby wrote a scholarly article called the Recirculating of the Saints. and his gist was just how much is there a churn and how much are you bringing new people in? And the key is by percentages. The churn is going to be inevitable.
Oh, sure.
You can stand
it.
up and say, look, if you're from another church, if you're from that church down the street that split, go back there and be healed and help be part of that healing. But you can't keep transfer people away. No. Even if you posture yourself. The key is, and JJ, I bet you do this all the time. If you go through the last year of people's stories you told from the pulpit, what you brag on, you get more of. And if you're continually talking about the person who comes to faith the first time to church in years and years and years, that messages the people in the congregation who are in that boat to say, oh, yeah, there must be lots of us here. This is an okay place for me. This is safe. I can do my journey as well. So, JJ, how often do you highlight a transfer person in one of your stories?
Never. No, I never do. And it's not because we're ashamed of it. Like you said, you can't listen, the great thing and the worst thing, or not the great thing, an awesome thing and a difficult thing about the people who come to your church is you can't control who comes to your church. And that's going to be a challenge sometimes, as awesome as that can be too. But no, we never highlight, but we always are highlighting the stories of the person who was far from God, who didn't go to church, who just got released from prison, who was an atheist, who life almost was lost in a car accident. We share and we highlight those, and we really try and build the church around those people. And so from our assimilation process to our marketing to the language that we use, when I say our mission statement is to make Jesus accessible to anyone, when we talk about the anyones, we define anyones as the religiously unaffiliated. That would be how we see anyones. And so that's who our church is built for. And I think when you know who your audience is, that shapes a lot of your, I will say this, I would say if we're not careful, we'll start a church built to reach lost people, but then we'll be influenced by the transfer growth, and then we'll lose the mission. Because some of the people who don't like the things that were happening at their last church will try and convince you, they bring finances, they bring people, they'll try and convince you that this isn't the way that you ought to do church. And you just got to stick to the thing that God called you to do. Never stop reaching lost people. Warren said it, that one of the best evangelistic tools is church planting. I just think because when there's no one coming to your church, the only thing you can do is reach lost people. Like the transfer people are not picking you because you got great lights or because you got great worship. Like you don't have those things right now. You really have to go into the Starbuckses, the YMCAs. You've got to go into the highways and byways and try and reach people. And you just can never lose that. So I'm all for, you can't be a church plant forever, but you should never lose your church plant heart. And because the people who are coming from other churches, like I said, they're coming and they're coming with either hurt or agendas. And so you just kind of can't lose that heart.
What is the upside and the downside of transfer growth, JJ? And then Warren, you've hinted at it a little bit, but let's start with JJ. And then I want to get back to the rest of the stats. I mean, we're almost 25 minutes in, but what is the upside and the downside of transfer growth?
So I'll say it quickly, and I think the upside is that they bring experience, and they know church, right? So like when you have an event or when you have some type of serving requirement or some type of outreach, they know church, they know what it is to tithe. That's the great. The downside is they're not just coming with their resources, they're also coming with their vision of what church should be, or they're hurt. And so you just have to stay to, again, the vision God's called you, and try and love people where they are and lead with an open hand. So that would be one of the downsides.
JJ said it well. I just want to add the down the road. JJ, you are a gifted evangelist. That's your heart. And it sounds like from you talking about your wife, that's her heart as well. There will come a certain time in the life of the church when there are enough people who have come to Christ, got grounded in their faith, and they're going to start making noise and saying, hey, what about us? You're always focused on that person who isn't yet here, and the next person, but what about us? And we're now the majority of the church. And you have to decide, how much focus do I put on helping them get deeper roots? That's absolutely essential, at the expense of always keeping the church focused outward, because gravity in every church, no matter how old it is an inward tug to an internal focus, which ends up with no new lives in Christ.
Mm-hmm. True.
That's so good.
Okay, other trends. Anything else you're seeing that is notable that you would like to reference off the top?
I'd like to talk about the role of vision. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, we ask, again, we had 2,700 people in this ECFA church plant study, so we could slice and dice all kinds of ways. We said, look at your vision in the next 5 years, and do you believe you will multiply how many times? And it was one of the few open-ended questions. And I took the two extremes. I took those who said 0, wrote in 0. And I took those who put 10 or more. No, 5 or more. Sorry. Again, this is the next 5 years. That's huge just to say 5. Those were the two extremes, and I compared them. And you can guess. Now, you're immediately going to say when you hear this comparison, well, is it chicken and egg or egg and chicken? But which one was growing? Which one was reporting higher conversion growth? Which one had more momentum in every different way? which one had a higher launch attendance, which one, and it was the one with the big vision. And I was amazed. We ask another question of to what extent, I'm going to read it because it was very purposely heavy. To what extent is the desire to create a network of multiplying churches, quote, very much part of your vision? Now, you would think long ago that would disqualify most churches. Hey, the Swedish Lutherans moved here and we're the church for the Swedish Lutherans. And if someone wants to become a Swedish Lutheran, we'll happily accept them in, but we're the focus for there. And I'm not picking on Lutherans or Swedes. Every single group has done this. But in answer to the question, was it very much part of your vision to create a network of multiplying churches? When you started, new churches said 36%. Today, new churches said higher, 43%. So they've grown. But wait, there's more. We asked that same question of multi-site churches. Was it part of your vision when you first started, 31%, to create this network of multiplying churches? What about your vision today? 52%. So all that to say, this idea of multiplication, of reproducing ourselves, has taken root. I think it's one of the biggest shifts we've seen in church planting, thanks to Exponential and many other groups, to say, hey, the goal of the gospel is to, 1 Timothy 2:2, the things you heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, commit to reliable people who will be qualified to teach others also. That's 4 generations of handoffs.
Wow. Yeah, and that is Dave Ferguson and Todd Wilson have done a lot of work. They've been on this show talking about multiplication, and it's wonderful to see that as a mindset. So on the one hand, if you want to paint a picture of the church, I think you could say in North America, you've got a majority of churches that are plateaued or declining and getting smaller every year. But those that are growing are really growing and have that idea of reproducing and multiplying and becoming multi-site, but also planting at the same time. J.D. Greer was on the podcast, and he talked about being a multiplying church and just an insane vision that they have to plant, I forget the number offhand. It was 500 or so churches, and they're way ahead of target, And it's that whole, which gives you hope for the future, I guess, in the end, doesn't it?
Well, it tells you there's going to be a parting of the way, because a different study that's done every 5 years in the year 2000 found that the average size of a U.S. church was 160. In the year 2005, it was less. In the year 2010, it was less. In the year 2015, it was less. In the year 2020, the survey was done just before the pandemic, and the average U.S. congregation size was 60 people.
I read that, and I almost couldn't believe it.
That's not sustainable financially, full-time pastor-wise, maintaining a building. I mean, it's just huge implications. And that's why mergers and new churches and everything else are balancing that out. All the while, many denominations and others are saying, here, let us help you figure out how do you do revitalization and turnaround.
What is happening? Because you've said this for years and people don't like it, and people on the internet beat up on these stats, but that the mega church is here to stay. Multi-site churches are here to stay. And there's almost like a counter movement to no, it's micro churches and it's this and it's that. Warren, what's your take on that in 2023?
Yes. There is permission and excitement about planting at every level. Some person says, I'm a gamer. I want to reach people in the Roblox community, and I'm going to do it that way. And it's going to be a small group and it's going to be an online church. There is a sense in the Christian community of, God bless you. That's awesome. But then there are others on the other extreme who are launching large. There are others who do the whole decentralized in the middle where we don't have a big gathering. We more have a big gathering to train leaders, if anything else. And I say, Mr. Edison and Mrs. Edison, for that matter, please keep inventing that new light bulb. Let's see what God wants to bless in this era. And it's going to be the church planters that are going to discover it. And others are going to say, we should learn something from them. We should try that. So this freedom to experiment. JJ, what all are you giving permission to?
Yeah, no,
at Journey Church?
Well, I just want to say to what you said and to answer Carey's question. I'm with you. I think that it's not that there's one model that's better than the other model, but that there are people who Jesus loves that are not going to be reached in a church like mine because of the amount of people that are in it or because of the style of it. And so I coach with, I'm a church plant coach with ARC, and also with a CMN, the Church Multiplication Network, which is the church planting arm of the Assemblies of God. And they're both different, but they both have the same mission. And I think it's a great, when you understand what they both do and how they do it differently, ARC really has a playbook and it's launch large. That's how we teach there. That's how we train there. And, the average church that's launching with ARC is launching somewhere like to 200 attendance size. That's their model. CMN is totally different.
And in our survey, across the years, about 18% launched large with 200 or more.
Yeah.
Little dip in 2020, but then back by 2021 continued. Sorry, JJ.
No, that's great data. And then at CMN, their model's a little different. We've helped plant biker churches that are meeting somewhere else. We've helped plant home churches. And there are just people that are going to identify with certain manifestations of church. I think one of my favorite stories to teach this is when Jesus is walking on the water and the disciples were afraid because they thought it was a ghost. And I've always taught that to our church. Like, we have to be ready to see Jesus when he appears in ways we don't expect him to. And churches that look in ways that we don't expect them to. And so, I think the more pastors that listen to this podcast, and particularly in this part right here, I think it's really going to help. You can't have, it's okay to have an appreciation for someone else's gift. Just don't let your appreciation turn into imitation. God might have given you a very specific way to do church. Don't allow society's definition of success, X amount of people, right? That's not success. In heaven, there's a party when one person gives their life to Christ, right? Just one. And so that's the way God called us to launch Journey Church. It was a launch large model. We have a multi-site model. We know who we are, but you might have a different, like he said, like Warren said, it might be Roblox. It might, by the way, Warren, the fact that you know what Roblox is, you really are a researcher, because I just found out what Roblox was like in the last 6 months through my kids. And so you're more in the know than I am. But I think we just got to shift the definition of success for these church planners, man. It's not about a big church. It's about the church that God called you to launch, because there's some people that will not come to Christ in my church because of the way it's structured, but they will in the one that God gave you the dream for.
So JJ, let's drill down on your church plant story. So you plant in the greater Orlando area in 2016. What were some of the initial challenges? You were trying to launch large, and I think a lot of people who listen know the ARC model. You want to get out of the gate with funding, with a core team, with volunteers, 200 people ideally or more on your opening Sunday, because we know it's going to be half of that the next week, right? We just know. Right. So, but then you build up from a solid base. So what were some of the initial challenges that you ran into in planting Journey Church?
So many expectations, money, people, experience. I mean, where did we start, right? We launched with 400. We launched with 400. It was our launch. Yeah, it was exciting, right? And crazy though, because of the culture that we live in today and the friends that I had, I thought, I don't know. I feel like we didn't succeed. I felt like that was my first lesson in learning not to tie.
So 400 wasn't enough?
It's never enough. That's the problem, right? That's the problem. Because then I was feeling at 400 what I felt at 1,000, what I felt at 2,000, what I felt at 3,000. I feel the same way. So you can't tie your identity to those things. And so, so I thank God I had an overseer, someone on our board who really spoke life into me and helped me just get my head right, because that was a huge win. But then we dipped to about 4 months in. The lowest we'd ever gotten was about 130. That was one of the hardest days I'll never forget it. I can remember the message I preached. I can remember what the room looked like. I remember the next off day after that. I remember wondering if I had missed God. So there's that. There's the attendance challenge. I think the other challenge was just trying to figure out who I was. So I'm Puerto Rican, and I grew up in a kind of Spanish Pentecostal church background, but God called us to launch at Winter Park. So if you know anything about Winter Park, Florida, it's the average age is retired, kind of 60 and above, very Caucasian. So I remember my first message, I was like, listen, this is not my audience, God. I don't know why you called me here. This is Andy Stanley's audience. And so what I did was I got a table, I got a board, I got a TV, I got the chair. I'd never preached like that before in my life, but I was like, this is what this demographic needs. And I'm a big Andy Stanley fan. And so I was like, I'm just going to shift who I am. And that was such a bomb. I'm a really bad Andy Stanley, most of us are really bad Andy Stanley. There's only one. But I'm a good JJ. So I just had to really nail down who I was and lean into that. And then we started to see more growth at the church there. Because the church was young, we had financial struggles. I mean, every age group brings their own benefits. So like the older the age, the more commitment you're going to have. The younger the age, the more involvement, passion, but they ain't got no money. They're still going to college, they're raising their little kids. I remember having a conversation with someone on the team and I saw what they had given one month and I was like, hey, I want to teach you about this thing called tithing. It's 10%. And they're like, oh, that is 10% of my check. I was like, oh, okay. Okay. All right. Well, you know what? Let's pray about that. Let's ask the Lord for some favor, some blessing. But yeah, that was a challenge. Building the team was hard because you don't have staff. So when you have a staff meeting, you're having to do it late at night when you should be with your family, or on the weekends when you should be with your family. Nobody can come in at 2:00 because they're at work, and your team is a bunch of volunteers. I wasn't paid for a year, and I went without a salary for a year and a half, just living on the selling of my home and the cashing out of my retirement account. And just living by faith. And so, yeah, honestly, so many challenges. It's a miracle that we got through it. And I look back on it now and I just, man, it's so crazy what God did.
I want to go back to the transformation in your teaching style, because I think we've all tried on different styles and kind of went, yeah, that one didn't work. Was it abrupt? Did you just ditch the TV and the table one week? Did you morph out of it? Yeah. And then tell me what that did to the audience and what it did to you.
So, it was abrupt. I tried it for the first couple of months. That was me. It was Andy Stanley style. And I remember my wife just telling me one time, just saying, be you, just be you. If God called you to this city, he must have did it. He must have knew what the city needed. If this city, I remember she said something one time, she said, if this city needed Andy Stanley, God would have put it in his heart to plant a church here, but he didn't. He put it in our heart. And so be you. And so when I did that, we started to see the congregation get more diverse. And then when the congregation got more diverse, we started people coming in our church and I would ask them. I remember anytime I saw somebody who was white, I would stop them in the lobby and be like, why did you decide to come to our church? I swear. I would ask all the time because it was mostly just Hispanic people that were coming. Because in the beginning, I think every church planter needs to know this. As much, we all have dreams of having a diverse church, but in the beginning, you will attract who you are. In the beginning, you will always attract who you are, and that's okay. And they started to come, and I asked them, I said, what made you pick Journey Church as your home? And they all said the same thing, and it was very humbling because then I realized God had a plan that I didn't realize. And they all said the same thing. They said, we love the diversity. Everything in this city is this way. Here, it's not this way. It's very diverse. And then I realized, well, that's why God would send a 30-year-old Puerto Rican to plant a church in one of the whitest cities in Central Florida because he wanted diversity to come to this area of our state. And so God had a plan. But that really changed and shifted. And ever since then, it's been a lot more freeing just to be me and understand that I think I tried to be a church for everybody at the same time. And that's hard too. Once I realized that I could just be me and I can let people go to the other churches where they identify more, boy, was that freeing, right? And then I had to shift, like, I'm not trying to grow Journey, I'm trying to grow the kingdom. And so the same thing I said about all the different types of churches, I had to realize my church was a different type of church. And I'm just going to own that. And I'm going to reach anybody that Journey can reach with my style of preaching. Maybe you don't like it because I shout too much, or I run around too much, or I sweat too much. That's fine.
You got a lot of energy.
Another church.
Yeah.
There's another church down the street. There's that is exactly what you need, and really coming to grips and accepting that idea that we're all kingdom, like that's such a freeing such a freeing feeling as a pastor and a preacher to know that God gave me a gift to reach a certain type of person. And if I can't reach someone else, that's someone else's job.
Let's talk about the inflection point. So month 4, you're down to 130. Yeah. We all know what that feels like. If you've led a church for more than a couple of months, you know what that feels like. You're discouraged. What helped reverse that?
Well, there's a couple of things. And I think our culture wasn't right yet. We had to fix that. So we had a lot of stuff to fix. I think that the inflection points happen when preparation meet opportunity. Like everybody's waiting for that event, that trigger, that catalyst. But that catalyst, that moment will come, but you got to be ready for it. So for us, it was a couple things. There's a couple catalysts. For us, there was the Orlando Sentinel, which is one of the largest. It's the second largest in all of Florida, the newspaper in all of Florida. The largest one, I can't remember which one it is, but second largest. They found out about our church. They came in and they saw that there were just a bunch of young people going to church. And so they hey, can we come and do a story? So we said, yeah, sure. Well, I didn't know. Cool. That story ended up on the front page of the Orlando Sentinel. And so, and I have the newspaper. It was at the same time that like Trump threatened to shut down Congress for like the budget stuff. Okay. And so like that's right there. And then right underneath the Senate and the Congress is a picture of me and our church. And so what happened was a bunch of people started coming. Now, here's the thing I tell people all the time, because I don't want to give just that paper the glory there, obviously God, but had our church not got healthy, a bunch of people would have came, had a terrible experience, and gone back home. So if we weren't prepared for that, the opportunity would have fell flat. So you got to be prepared. Then 2020 came, right? And so at that point, now we're running probably over 1,000 people. Then 2020 came. I think we were right before 2020, we were probably around 1,300. We were portable at the time. Everything shut down. We changed our venue 5 times in 2020. 5 times. We used to joke about it. Every time I would get up to preach, I'd be like, listen, if you want to know where we're having church next week, you're going to need to have the gift of prophecy here, because I don't know either. And so somebody connect with the Lord. And 5 times until finally we found an abandoned Highlight Stadium that Warren got the chance to visit not too long ago, and sits about 1,200 people. It was sitting empty, completely run down. We put money in, we invested in it. We were probably 1,200 before the pandemic. We had dropped down to 700. And then the building, though, was on the corner of one of the busiest intersections in Central Florida. I mean, 436 and 1792. Anybody would know it. It's historic. Elvis played here. Kiss played here. Like, it's a historic center. It's just old and run down. And so we got in here. And then in the last 2 years, we've grown from the 700 to almost 3,000. And it was another inflection point. I think the building had a lot to do with that too, the location. But every moment we had gone through something as a church that helped prepare us for the next thing.
Super helpful. And congratulations. Warren, we were talking about this episode. You and I emailed back and forth. And I said, it would be really cool to talk about the findings, but also get a church planter on what do you see in JJ that is typical of church plants, but also atypical of leaders or church plants, because you're probably on the high end of growth, of churches planted 6-7 years ago. You would be certainly in the top 10 percentile, if not 90th percentile, or however they do that math. You'd be up there. So Warren, what do you see? Typical and atypical.
I want to do the typicals first. JJ, you love the Lord and you are passionate for him. I've listened to enough of your sermons, been in the worship, that I don't ever want to assess something and say, oh yeah, and they're preaching this. You're spot on in your heart for Jesus and in your desire to become more like him every day. And that just front and central. Beyond that, you're teachable. The word disciple means learner. That how many times in this interview have you said, well, we learned this, we learned that you and your team are discerning, what's working, what's not. You took huge risk. You just like blew this off in a sentence. We sold our home and cashed that in and used up all our savings. And you said that clearly not to get attention to yourself. You almost buried it at the end of a sentence. But behind that is a huge sacrifice. And I know a little bit more of your story. Your parents did that too. They sold their home. They moved up to help you. You called in all the relatives, and that's very common for church planners. Anybody that likes us at all, we need help. Be part of this. And they were. JJ, you, besides huge risk and the family involvement, your first staff was all homegrown. And you didn't know, and you were all learning together, and you'll probably experience the realities that some have found their sweet spot already. And that's where God is blessing, but they're not able to keep growing to new levels. And you kind of add people in between them and you, and it can get awkward, but that's all part of the delights of being able to home grow people. You told me when I asked you, now here's a contrast. When I asked you, okay, so how did the core group started? You told me you brought people into your home for leadership development. And that is markedly different from how most people would approach it. Because really, if I, as the leader, can't reproduce myself into people who in turn reproduce themselves, then you have already put an immediate cap on where you're able to go. You have a boldness to ask for commitment. And you're not ashamed for that. And I think I appreciate Carey going back to the inflection point. I can't think how many people would have said, okay, honey, we tried, we did our best and it was a great initial season, but here's where we're going to settle. You refuse to settle because there are people to be reached. And you kept saying, how do we figure out how to connect the unchanging gospel to this changing culture and get more disciple making happening out there? And to this day, you're still thinking, who's next?
Yeah, that's very kind. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I think we all need a Warren Bird in our life. Don't we?
Oh, yeah,
don't we all need a Warren Bird in
yeah.
our life? My goodness, you have the gift of
100%.
encouragement. But
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of validity to that. I want to talk about the leadership development sessions in your house early on.
Yeah.
What did they look like? Because it would be tempting to do a Bible study. It would be tempting to just gather people to hang out, build culture. Talk about leadership development, JJ.
Yeah. So one of the challenges I shared about church planning early on is that your whole staff is volunteer. So they can't meet, during the day. Your job isn't their job. They have their own jobs. And so we would have them on Sundays after church and we would do them weekly. So we would do setup, we do tear down. So, 5 a.m., 6 a.m. portable, trying to turn a high school into a church. And then you do a service, you have to put it all away. And then instead of going home, I'd invite them all over the house. And then we'd spend the next 2 hours, wins, losses, ways that we can grow. And then also I'd bring a leadership teaching. I just knew early on I wasn't going to be able to do it, by myself. I knew we needed a team. And that was great. That was great because we didn't know who our leaders really were yet. You have some idea of who's going to be with you. And then you get into practice and then you start realizing, oh man, the one I thought was going to make it, they're not going to make it. And then this person, I just met them and they're crushing it. They're doing great. And so it was really an opportunity for us to kind of sift through and just see who was meant to be with us in the next kind of phase. But yeah, we still talk about those. We call them leadership labs, and we did it when our staff was volunteer on Sundays. Now we have them every Monday with our paid staff. But before that, it was just so we still do them. But now the people get paid to be here, they have them on Monday during the day.
Warren, one of the research points is that the larger the funding, the more money a church has at launch, the larger the initial attendance. Can you explain that from a data perspective? And then JJ, I'm going to ask you, how did you secure your initial fundraising other than selling everything and moving on, right? So I'd love to talk about that.
I need to underscore that funding was not given entirely to you as the church planner. That does not birth a church. If you say, hey, we got this big, parcel of money, go plant a church. You have to have ownership in raising the funds yourself.
So if somebody comes along, drops $500,000 in your bank account and says, go plant a church, that doesn't guarantee success. That's such a good distinction.
No, it doesn't. But I would put a fork in the road there.
Good.
The one person who says that, okay, praise God. Now I'm going to go raise some more money
Okay.
to add to that.
Yeah.
And we're going to have an incredible impact versus saying $500,000, we're set. We don't have to do anything with finances for the next couple of years. We can run with it. That's not going to work out. So the visionary to call for committing my life to Jesus Christ is the same visionary who's able to baptize my wallet and show me how to put God first in everything. Now, that said, let me go to, the funding sources are multiple. We ask in this survey, is your church self-supporting? And a surprising 20% of them started self-supporting from day one. By year 3, 78% were financially self-supporting. But the sources of income were fascinating. I gave them like 10 categories. Does your spouse have a full-time job? Surprising amount, yes, that's contributing toward. That's, Carey, another contrast with 20 years ago when you were looking, to have just one income source for the family. I asked, did your relatives kick in pre-launch? And 8% of the funding came from relatives.
Wow.
Did you have a side job? An amazing number of people intentionally had that side job. So there were multiple income sources leading up to the launch. But that said, now, Carey, now I'm ready to agree with you that the larger the kitty, the larger the scale on which you can launch, and the larger the impact that you have, assuming you've got a commensurate core group as well.
Okay, that's fascinating. And it sounds to me, tell me if this is a simplification, because I can do that with stats. It sounds like skin in the game. You need skin in the game, right?
Totally.
Okay. All right. Is there a number like $100,000, $200,000, $500,000? Like, what was there a number that seemed to really help?
I did come up with a number. You download the reports at ecfa.org/surveys. You can see the numbers. But the problem is, think the downtown Cleveland church planter versus JJ and Winter Park. This is two different economic groups being targeted, two different communities in terms of rental and standards. It's really dangerous, I think, to hold up a single number and say, you need this much. It's much more you need to say, you need to be able to fund it and cast the stewardship vision.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so JJ, on the ground, what did that look like for you guys and for Journey Church?
So our total launch budget, and having done this with other churches, I would say that ours is probably on the lower end. So if you're looking for more of a specific number, I've seen the churches that I've worked with, Warren's got the actual data, but just anecdotally speaking with churches that have launched, I've seen a lot of churches launch with about 150 to 200,000 or more. That's what it has cost to launch a church, depending where you are. Your city determines a lot of that. So our budget was probably $140,000. So that would be part on the lower end of what I've seen with churches. The sources for that were, the majority of that was honestly, we sold our home, we cashed out our retirement account, and then we partnered with two organizations that gave us each about $40,000 each. And so that was the other half of it. And then the other part of it came from visiting with other churches. The smallest part of it came from visiting with other churches, asking for help from other churches in the city, from people's tithes. They were tithing even though the church hadn't launched yet. And so the three buckets were our own investment, which skin in the game. I mean, it's a whole thing when you've sold it all and you're just, this gotta work. This has got to work. I had to apologize to my lead pastor when I was as a youth pastor, because he would always tell me to evangelize. And I would always tell him, and I'd be like, Pastor, I'm inviting people to church. Then I became a church planner, and my family's livelihood depended on growing this church. Eternity should be enough motivation. I know that someone's going to listen to this podcast and be like, bro, don't you believe in heaven and hell? That should be enough. I'm with you. I'm sorry. I'm human. That was motivation. The other motivation was, we got no plan B here. This has got to work. And so I was out there witnessing to everybody that I could, because we were just all in. And so those are the three buckets that that it came from.
Did you?
And I've seen churches with.
How early did you start?
I was going to say I've seen churches
How
with.
early did you start?
Go ahead, Warren. I've seen churches with $500,000
How
not make
early did
it.
you start teaching stewardship?
I waited too long. I waited about a year before I taught it, because I was afraid as a church plant that our reputation in this city would develop for this money. But then I really had to wrestle with that myself. And do you believe what the Bible says or not? Mm-hmm. If you believe what the Bible says about stewardship, and if you believe what the Bible says about generosity, why would you withhold these kinds of blessings from people? So I had to wrestle with that internally. Now we talk about it every year. We'll have a series on stewardship in some way, shape, or form every year. So, but it took me about a year to build up the courage as a young church planter to speak about the topic.
Well, that was one of my questions. Did you raise even a meaningful percentage of the initial funding from your core, right? Because you get these outside sources. You cashed out, your family cashed out, you got these two sources and other churches. But like when you thought about the 7,500, 200 volunteers you launched with, were they contributing from the early stages or not so much?
Yeah, that we did ask if you can be a part of the launch team. We're asking for two things. We're asking, well, three things, asking that you join us in prayer. We're asking that you serve, and we're asking that you begin the tithe here and call this church your home.
Okay. Warren, did you have any other questions on funding or observations on funding before we shift gears?
Well, let me just talk about the ratio of launch team to kickoff attendance.
Yeah.
We found it, because that has to do with the finances. We found that it's about 1 to 3 on average. So if you have 10 people in your core team, you're likely to launch with 30. And then as Carey mentioned earlier, you kind of drop back for weeks 2, 3, and sometimes 4, and then you grow from there. If you have 100 people in your core group, you're likely to have 300 at your launch. Or if you have 1,000 in your core group, you're likely to have 3,000. And that impacts your finances. Many church planners today kind of have multiple launches. Well, we're going to have the first public Sunday. We're going to have the grand opening Sunday. Where you just keep starting level playing field all over again, each with a different size core group, if you will, each of whom has the excuse to invite friends, and each of whom feels the responsibility. Hey, I need to make this happen financially as well.
Yeah, that totally checks out. Rich Birch may have got this from you. You guys know Rich, but he always says, if you want 200, you need 75 core committed volunteers who are there. Mm-hmm. And it's basically that 3-to-1 ratio. So you must have had about 125, 130 core people to launch at 400. Is that about right? Does that math check out?
I would add a layer to that. And again, this is just my story. Warren's here for the hard facts, the data. But my story is,
I'm median.
I think you're going to be 3X. I think that's where you settle. That would be my suggestion. So we launched with 400, but we settled at 3X. So I would add a layer to that.
Why? Because your great aunt and grandmother came, and all these other well-wishers came, and so on and so forth.
100%, 100%.
Okay. Got it. Plus all the people from the church that kind of launched you came over just to applaud. Yep. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So JJ, I'd love to know, in what ways do you think, because you've had tremendous growth. What is your budget today compared to 2016 and 140 to kick it off?
Oh man, oh man. I was looking at it just the other day. I mean, we pull in a week now. This was really bad. Remember I told you it took us a year to teach on stewardship? So when you hear this, it'll make sense. We bring in a week now what we brought in our first year.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And that's because I did not touch on that subject. And if I would encourage church planners, you touch it sooner. Don't be afraid of what you think you're afraid of. If it's not your heart, if that's really not your heart, then you don't have to be afraid of coming off that way. If you really are in it to honor God and to see people live a blessed life, then be obedient to teach the Bible.
And JJ, I like your words. Earlier, I used the word stewardship, and you kind of corrected to say generosity. Much better word. And now the blessed life and caring for others. Those are the words that resonate today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a fear of it as well, partly because I hadn't heard it talked about growing up in church. It's like the only time you hear about money is when the pastor needs money. And I fell into that trap and then had to do a reboot. So what was your, how did you overcome your fear?
Mentors, I read a lot. I try and learn. I'm grateful for the overseers in our life, the board that we have. And I was just sharing with them some of the wrestling matches that I was having with the topic. And it was one of our board members who told me, who's a pastor at the church, hey man, do you believe what the Bible says? If you believe what the Bible says, then don't be afraid to preach the Bible. And the Bible says a lot. I mean, Jesus talks more about money than any other topic. And so it matters. It matters to God. And that's why we have to talk about it. And that's actually how that has informed the way I preach about it. So you can go back on our YouTube. Anytime you see money in the topic, in the title of one of our YouTube sermons, you'll hear me start it off by saying, we're talking about this because Jesus talks about this, because this matters. And because we want to be a church that is speaking to the things that you're talking about around your kitchen table. And here's what I know. What I know one of those conversations are about is finances. Whether you're a young adult looking to pay college, a parent looking to send your kid to college, trying to move into a home, trying to get a car, stressed out with debt. It's something which is why God talks about it so much, right? Because where your money is, or your heart is also, your treasures, or your heart is also. And so that was, for me, was the shifting moment for me. And just knowing that it's in, because preachers preach the Bible. So when you realize it's in there, and that's just the truth, like it's just, I got to do it.
Well, and a big inflection point, I agree with you. There were couples, if you don't talk about money, there were couples on their way to church who had a fight about money in the car on the way to church, right? And so you're going to just ignore that. You'll talk about prayer, you'll talk about the Bible.
Yeah.
You won't talk about one of the biggest tension points in their life. And the aha moment for me was, I'm going to talk about it when we don't need it. Well, you kind of have it every week, but we're not asking anything today. But I want to talk about it from a perspective of what I want for you, not what I want from you. I want you to pay cash for your next car. I want you to save for your kids' retirement. Wouldn't it be nice not to take a vacation on Visa, but to pay cash for it? Like, we actually want to help you with that. And the Bible has a lot to say about that. And once I turned that corner, it was so easy to talk about it. I was excited to talk about it. But that took me a long time.
That's so great. And one of the things that I say when I talk about the topic is, because you touched it right there, talking about it when you don't need to. So I'm like, here's some things you need to know about our church. Okay. Our church is zero debt, which really means we don't own property. but I can say that now that we don't own property, I can say that I can get in front of our church and say, just in case you think we have some ulterior motives for this money, we have zero debt as a church. We don't owe anybody anything, 0%. Also, our staffing salary budget, we're below 40% of our annual income. The average church in America, more closer to 50%. You need to know that. Just we're stewarding it well. You also need to know that we budget 90% of last year's income is our operating income for this year. So we take 90% of last year. That's I just need you to know that we're good. We're so good here at Journey Church Finance. We're good. Are you? Let's help you, right? And then let's talk about it. So
that's
pivot.
A pitch.
Yeah.
Wow. So you must have a robust volunteer culture. If you're staffing, I follow ratios with church staff. Like, you're right. Most churches are 50 to 60%, or if you're getting on the healthier side. And what that means is, let's say you're $1 million church, your payroll is somewhere between 50 to 60% of that million. If you're a little bit healthier, it's in the 40s. If you're super healthy, it's 40 or lower. And what that actually means is you have more volunteers, is what it means. So what are you doing about volunteer culture? Because when I talk to leaders, the number one post-COVID issue, in addition to let's get people back or where did all the people go, is we got lots of people, we don't have volunteers anymore. How did that hit your church?
Yeah.
Just before JJ jumps in, let me comment on what happened during the pandemic.
Totally.
Churches had staffing, had wanted to keep their staff. The pandemic shut things down. So the staff who had been training lay people moved to volunteer, to move to take the jobs as other duties as described. that the lay people had. And then after the pandemic, you've got all these staff doing what volunteers used to do. Now you not only have to woo people back to church, but to invite them to serve and to invite them to take the things that staff had been doing. And they're like, well, you've got somebody doing it. So it's a really awkward time of shifting.
I have not heard that theory. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's interesting. That really is. Yeah. Plus, everybody reset, right? People left, people reassessed. So talk about high volunteer engagement and how that's played out at Journey Church.
Yeah, so we had to make it a focus. So we operate kind of under Patrick Lencioni, the advantage, kind of the idea of what's the most important thing. So we've had the most important thing now for, I want to say 2 years. We have a quarterly where our staff gets together. And the most important thing for the last 2 years coming out of the pandemic has not been growth, has not been increasing income, has not been developing assimilation processes or launching a second campus or going multi-site. The most important thing for the last 2 years has been volunteer growth 20% year over year and volunteer retention 80% year over year. And we developed the internal systems and software. We actually have a software developer on staff here who created a software for us to be able to track those metrics on demand. She calls it Soultrix, which I love. And so she uses Soultrix, and we are able to track exactly what on each team. So I can tell you in our greeters, I can tell you in our kids, the percentage growth and the percentage retention. And we're trying to get our teams to that kind of a metric, 20% growth year over year, 80% retention. And then the way we do that is we have a structure of leadership, which probably a lot of churches would be familiar with, kind of directors, coordinators, team leaders, kind of the Jethro principle of one overseeing a certain amount. And then we have special events throughout the year that are targeted toward each layer of leadership. And each event, it really falls into one of three categories. It's either some type of celebration, it's some type of development, or it's inspiration. And so we have those separated throughout our calendar. We have a leader book that we give to all of our dream teamers, and we spent a lot of money, we spent a lot of time, but we're intentional. And I think half the problem is figuring out the problem. And I think once you figure out the problem and you ask the right questions, right, then you can read the right books, then you can listen to the right podcasts, then you can have the right conversations with your team. So we just realized that was going to be a pain point for us coming out of the pandemic. And that's been the most important thing for the last 2 years. And we haven't moved on because we get closer to that number, but we haven't hit that number yet. And I've just told our staff, they asked us, in our last offsite, they're like, hey, when are we going to talk about something else? And I'm like, when we fix it. When we fix it, we'll talk about something else.
That's a really strategic choice, JJ, because I think, if I heard you correctly, you said you dipped down to about 700 post-pandemic. Mm-hmm. So you're almost half the size that you were heading into the pandemic. And Florida had a shorter pandemic than a lot of places. But,
absolutely.
I think a lot of leaders just panicked and pivoted to attendance. And you were smart. Now, interestingly enough, I heard you also say, and I just want to confirm this, you're running just shy of 3,000 now on the weekend?
Yeah.
All right. So you've almost quadrupled in size. You've quadrupled in size. I assume there's been a financial increase with that. That's huge growth in the last 2 years. But you're staying focused on the volunteer metric.
Oh, yeah.
I want you to unpack that a little bit more, because I think that's a great strategic choice that 98% of leaders would never make. But I commend you for doing it. So drill down on that a bit more.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a metaphor guy. So but I can't think of the one right now, but I'm trying to search for a metaphor of, I'm trying to search for a metaphor of I'm trying to search for something that, why do you get up in the morning? And they're like a responsibility. If somebody at my job is waiting for me. If I don't show up to my job's not going to get done. Mm-hmm. I have a responsibility. I have a commitment. Average church attendance, you're the data guy. I've got Warren here. Tell me, what is it? What is the average church attendance a month?
Well, you said the median is
You mean
63.
frequency of attendee?
Oh,
in a month.
yeah, that's probably changed too. But it used to be 1 in 3. I bet you it's moved to 1 in 4. Warren, do you have different stats or?
Somewhere between 1 and 2 times a month for the typical church attendee.
Okay. So let's take that. So that means that the other 2 times or 3 times that person woke up and told themselves, which we would never get because we're all pastors here, told themselves, I think I'm not going to go to church today. And or part of the reason was because if I don't go, it's not like somebody's counting on me. It's not like somebody's waiting for me there. It's not like I have any form of responsibility or investment there. I'm just not going to go. We'd realize that if we can get people on teams, that's a reason to come to church every Sunday. That's a reason to come to church. Somebody's counting on you to do something to impact somebody's life. And it's more than, because I can hear someone in the chat, when they listen, it's guilt, it's shame. It's like, if you don't come, you're dropping the ball. No, it's purpose, right? It's like this is why I get to be a part of the church. Like as pastors, we have to realize that our job is not to do the ministry. According to Paul, our job is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And so when I understand that, then my philosophy has to change as well. And now I got to start getting them on the team, so that they can feel the weight of it in a good way, and also the celebration, and also just I'm a part of something big. And I want to speak to the pastor who's like, or the leader who's like, and you know what? I want to make sure that I don't want to burn people out. I don't want to burn. That's the big thing. I don't want to burn people out. We'll hire someone to do that. Let's not. Are you a comic book fan? Anybody on this video a comic book fan?
Not
Superman?
really, but I'm sure we have tens of thousands of listeners. So tune in.
So there's a volume where Superman dies. Okay, in the comics, and Metropolis, the crime rate in Metropolis. What do you think happened to the crime rate in Metropolis when Superman died?
Went up.
Yeah, you would think that. But all of your comic book fans who are listening to this podcast right now will tell you that the crime rate actually dropped. And the reason why the crime rate dropped when Superman died is because everybody was waiting around for Superman to stop the bad guys. And when they realized there was no more Superman, everyone decided, I have to do my part. We have too many pastors and leaders trying to be Superman, trying to do it all, hire people to do it all. And we're taking, and so people are coming to church and they're just receiving. And and that's all that they're doing. And they're not stepping into their God-given design. When Superman dies, Metropolis steps up and realizes, if I don't do this, no one else is going to do this. My city doesn't need JJ. My city needs me. My city needs my brother. My city needs my sister. My city needs my gifting, my calling. It's just amazing. And then it also answers the question, Carey and Warren, why people don't care. Why don't people care about church? You remember the story of, now we're all pastors, I know we'll all get this one, David and Aruna. Right? David goes to get a place to get land. He goes to Aruna and he offers to buy the land. And Aruna says, you can have it. And then David looks back at Aruna and he says, I will not give the Lord something that costs me nothing. Because what David knows that we need to remind ourselves is that value is attached to sacrifice, to cost. When you pay for something, you care more about that thing. And I'm not going to give God something. And so now, funnily enough, the land that he buys, we all know that becomes the Temple Mount. So the church was actually built on sacrifice, which is my next connection. We try and take the sacrifice away from people by doing the work, but we're actually taking away their investment and their care and their love in the local church by doing that. And so we've got to give them a chance to pay. So that they can feel that purpose, that value, that love. Like I've got 5 different pairs of shoes. My wife's got 30 different pairs of shoes in her closet, but there's one pair of shoes, man. It's like up high. I don't know a lot about shoes, but I'm telling you that pair, I bet you that pair is expensive because it's up high. It's not with the rest of the shoes. It's off in the corner. We treat things differently that have higher costs attached to them. So we've got to make the gospel accessible, but we've got to make church come at a cost.
I can see why you are probably getting closer to that goal. That's very encouraging, very inspiring. So man, we could cover a lot of ground. I want to ask you a couple more questions. JJ, we've talked almost exclusively about physical attendance showing up in the building, but you have a really robust online presence. I mean, great YouTube presence. Obviously, you take video seriously. You live stream. So you're kind of bursting at the seams in person, but you've really ramped up your online presence. Do you want to talk about why, and then also the specific things that you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk about why. The why is because, and I think there's a pushback now. Some people are afraid that if we go too much into online, we're going to see a dip in local attendance.
I got that question today again. I hear from it all the time, which is why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, am I going to cannibalize? Is it going to eat it up? Are people not going to come? And I think I get it. It's valid, and I don't want to play it down. For me, I've got one goal, but two goals. Yes, I want to build this church but also I want to get people connected to community. But I also have this goal of expanding the kingdom. And so if it's going to help me reach people, then that's what I want to do more than anything. God didn't call me to populate an auditorium. He called me to populate heaven. And so whatever's going to help populate heaven, that's what I want to be about. And so we put a lot of money into it. We get the expensive cameras. We do what we can because we know that we're going to reach people online more than we will in person. It's an easier invite to church to share a link from a YouTube sermon than it is to get you to put on clothes, put your perfume on, get your makeup done, and come to the church on Sunday. If I want to introduce you to the gospel, sharing a YouTube link, man, that's like the easiest thing in the world. It's easy for the receiver. It's easier for the Christian trying to be an evangelist. It's just so simple. We get so many people that come to the church because of it, and we're reaching people that I could have never reached. I mean, can I share just two quick stories? So one, some of our biggest financial gifts have come from people that have never been in person at our church. I mean, some of our biggest financial gifts. Just thank you so much for what you do. Your church is ministering to me and my family. End of the year offering gift. There's that. We had baptisms recently. We had a family that lives in Miami, which is about 4 hours south of us in Orlando. They found out we were having baptism Sunday. They drove up for that Sunday just to get baptized in person and then drove back home. But my favorite online story is a couple who was living together, not married, driving down the road in California. Someone shared our sermon, our YouTube. They listened to it while driving, the podcast, listened to it while driving, pulled over on the side of the road. This is their story. Pulled over on the side of the road, repented, came back to the Lord, say, hey, we got to get right. We can't be living this way anymore. We need God's help. They had a kid already, but we got to make some changes. They got on a plane, flew to Orlando, Florida. Now, this isn't sustainable, right? You're not going to build your church this way, but there's building your church, and then there's just expanding the kingdom. Got on a plane, flew to Orlando, got baptized on Baptism Sunday, shared their story in the middle of the pools, and then we married them in my office after the baptism. So they got married and baptized on the same day. And that was all because, yeah, it's really cool. And that's all because of the online presence, being able to reach people through that way. So I'm just such a big fan, a big believer. Now, I do think that, and I hope this doesn't come off any kind of way, but I think you would agree that every leader has strengths. And so you got to look at your strengths. If your church has the strength, and if your leader has that strength, that communication and that online, then you need to double down in that. But if your strength is something else, building teams, creating systems, I think you got to double down in that. I think early on we realized what we could be good at Journey, and we put our resources behind that to try and double down on our strengths and then bring other people around us who can help us in our weaknesses. So it's just some stories, and I love online. I love that we're able to reach people.
I love that part of it too, for sure. Warren, any data or observations on church plants and technology?
Yeah, let's divide it into here to stay and the jury's still out.
Okay.
Here to stay is people check out your church by its website first. Used to be the parking lot was the first impression. The website, whatever size church you are, they're going to check it out. Mm-hmm. They're going to ask two questions fundamentally. Are people like me there? And is this is there a scary factor? Is there something that, is going to weird me out too much? Also, the newcomer connection. Now, it may not be their first week there, but scan the QR code, tell us either your email or your phone or both, and that becomes a primary communication tool. I am just amazed at especially the younger generation, so willing to give that up. But carrying it further, hybrid stuff, like my wife and I just finished a couple's marriage class at our church. We kicked it off in person. We ended it with a happily ever after party afterwards. But all the nights of the group were online. So this couple with 5 kids, they finished the last kid in bed. They flopped down on the sofa, embraced each other, and were part of the class. They would never have gotten a sitter, driven somewhere, and maybe one week, but not week after week after week. So the hybrid experience is here to stay. Now, where the jury is still out for churches large and small is not the evangelism and the outreach. And JJ, it's such a wonderful story, the California story. Those will happen. And now, due to the pandemic, the gospel is in every language accessible all around the world for people to hear. It's a brilliant strategy as one of the silver linings of the pandemic. But is it primarily a member equipping and evangelistic strategy? Or is it also a discipleship strategy? Mm-hmm. Can discipleship also happen at the same level? Now, granted, I can't hug. Yeah. I can't, like Good Friday for me.
Good question.
When I'm not that emotional, but every time I do one of those crosses where I nail the nails in, and that's me nailing the nails and crying. Well, I can't do that online. Mm. But in person, it moves me. So there's certain in person that is it better or is it not? And I was just last week with a bunch of executive pastors from mega churches of a particular denomination, and they're ambivalent. They're still deciding what to do. There are a few pioneers. Carey, you wrote the foreword to Tim Lucas's Liquid Church book. And Liquid Church, 5,500 before the pandemic, says, okay, we may reach thousands in person, but let's figure out how to seamlessly reach tens of thousands of people beyond that. Mm-hmm. And church plants are, with whatever their capacity level, depending on their size, are likewise saying, can we have an online impact of discipleship even beyond the broadcasting? So jury's still out on a lot of things, but I'm excited about the possibilities.
It's a good summary. So good. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground. Anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about before we wrap up?
Carey, you graciously primed us with some questions, and one of them is, what mistakes do you see are being made?
Oh yeah.
And I'd like to highlight something JJ said early on. Not Ephesians 4:11 and 12, not equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry. And that may be that I need to do it all myself, that the Superman analogy that you gave, or it may be that I'm not doing a very good job of equipping the saints. And I'm teaching them, but not training them. Mm-hmm. And that factor of releasing people into their God-given ministry makes all the difference. Yep. In the effectiveness and growth, not just of a church plant, but of any church.
So good.
Good word. JJ, mistakes you're seeing or mistakes you made? You talked about a few, so feel free to just throw it out there.
I'll throw one in to close out that probably doesn't get spoken about enough. And so to Warren's point, 100%, you've got to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. But I think when people ask me, what's one thing that I wish I would have done differently? That's the question I get all the time when I meet with church planners. What's one thing you wish you would have done differently? My answer is always the same, and they're always discouraged when they hear it. They're always like, I thought you were going to say something different. And my answer is, I wish I would have prayed more. I think I underestimated the spiritual weight of trying to take territory, literally trying to take territory away from the enemy when you're planting a church. And I was all about the strategies. I was all about the systems. I was all about the approaches. I was all about the branding and the logo. And because I figured, my yes was enough. My yes was enough. but really committing to a prayer life, like it's about saying yes every day. It's about resurrendering. So in 2023, we've spent probably the least we have on marketing in this year, and we've grown the most and just in the 4 months already. And the only thing we've done different is add a Saturday morning every week prayer service. It's the only thing we've done different. And I think hearing, what was going on in Asbury, and I think there's a move coming to our country, if it's not already here, and if the church is going to make a shift somewhere, because we're all starting to look alike, we all serve coffee in the lobby. We all have lights. There's only one thing you can't copy from me. There's only one thing you can't copy. There's only one thing you can't transplant. You got to go get it yourself, and it comes at a cost, and there's no dollar amount. And that's the presence of God. And I at least for where we stand. And I think it just comes through prayer. So I just encourage, I know there's a lot to think about. I know you got to be a business person, and you got to be a marketer, and you got to be a student, and you got to be a conflict resolution guy, and you got to be a counselor, and you got to be a mom, and you got to be a dad. Like, I know all that, but above all of those things, you have to be a son or daughter of God. You got to be a son or daughter of Christ above all those things. So that would be my one mistake that I see a lot of church planners making.
I don't know that we can top that. That's a really good one to go out on. Man, Warren, any final thought or word?
Yeah, just to underscore the key difference church planners make. Church planners speak a certain language to a certain cohort, just like a youth leader connects with the youth group and can grow up. They are an irreplaceable group who understands the next generation, whatever that is, someone in their 20s, late teens, early 30s. They get the metaphors. They speak in the expressions. They identify with the things that are watched streaming or otherwise. And that group can reach a certain segment, the next segment of American society that no one else can do. So JJ, it was so encouraging to come and worship, at Journey and see how many young adults, people your age and a little bit younger, are beginning their spiritual journey. And that's the story of church planting over and over.
Well, thank you, Warren, for paving the way. I think when I first met you, I said, man, I read 3 or 4 of your books already. And so thank you for paving the way, for being a leader. If we've gone anywhere, it's because we stand on the shoulders of people like yourself. We stand on the shoulders of leaders and pastors who've gone before us. And we're just learning and growing on the work that they've done and the work that you've done. So thank you so much for being a pioneer and a mentor to so many people, including myself.
Well, I can't win the world to Christ, but you can, and I can help you do it. So that's my joy.
And I think Warren actually writes 3 or 4 books a month. I'm pretty sure that's his current monthly output.
Yes, I'm behind. I got to catch up.
JJ, give us where people can track with you and your church online. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
Yeah. At Journey ORL is our church Instagram. JourneyORL.com is our church website. Mine is at JJ_Vasquez. And that's where we are. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. And Warren, tell us more about where people can find you and these incredible data sets that you produce through the ECFA.
And Carey, you were just recently on our podcast and did a great job talking about the leader's soul. ECFA.org/surveys for some of my research, and for churches that want to be certified in integrity, accredited, 7 integrity standards that honor God and ultimately not just help win the world for Christ, but raise up more donors. Check that out too. My next book coming off the press is at resiliencefactor.info. And it's about how to do teams that are unbreakable. And the potential of teams is way untapped, especially coming out of the pandemic.
Well, Warren Bird, JJ Vasquez, thank you so much. I really appreciate you both. Thanks for all the great work that you do, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.